Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a May and June reading wrap up. I was going to stick to just June, but I realized that I only read, I think, 4 books. I'm actually finishing one today, The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, but I had some time to film today, so I figured, you know what, to make it a more substantive video, I will include both what I read in May and June. Yeah, let's get started. So I guess I'll start with what I'm drinking today, and that is a beer called Distance Measures from Abnormal out of San Diego, California. It's pretty perfect for our times right now. It's a double hazy IPA, so let's try it. It's incredible. This one's 9.2%, so I'll probably be needing a nap after this, but yeah, it's really good. Highly recommended if this is in your area. So in May, I read In the Dreamhouse by Carmen Machado. I spoke about this one in my BookTube newbie tag video, but I absolutely loved it. In case you don't know what this book is about, it's a memoir in which she tells the story of an abusive relationship she was in with a woman. She uses each chapter or essay as a different narrative trope, whether that be a Bildungsroman or erotica or a plot twist. She uses many different, I think over 100 types of tropes to tell her story, and I thought it was just so well done, and I was so excited to read each next chapter to kind of see how she could, you know, use those tropes to reflect some aspect of her relationship. And while it's a very devastating story, there is hope in it, and she also uses some of the chapters as sort of essays as well. One is regarding queer villainy. She says it much more eloquently than I can, but she says queer people can be villains because we are human. We don't have to always be seen in a positive light. We can be villains, we can be horrible people because we're all human, and that's it, period. Period! I thought that was really enlightening to see, you know, kind of her take, you know, her relationship and her girlfriend at the time, who was extremely abusive to her, be able to examine that relationship now upon reflection. And I thought it was absolutely beautiful. Right now I'm reading her short story collection that came out before this, called Her Body and Other Parties, which is similarly incredible. It's basically queer horror short stories, and I really enjoy those so far. So I highly recommend this one. Another book I read is Fever Dream by Samanta Schweblin. And this one I enjoyed. I didn't love it though. It's basically kind of fitting with the title. It is a story of a woman who is hospitalized, and she's speaking with a boy, figuring out why she's in the hospital and who this boy is. And I think this one's best to go into blind because that's my dog groaning. He's over this video apparently. So yeah, this one's basically, it's kind of a horror novel, but it touches on some, you know, interesting issues throughout about, you know, environmental issues. But yeah, so this is her first book, I believe, released in English. And I liked it. It wasn't my favorite, but I think it's super short and the hardcover is like very small. So you can easily read it in one sitting if you want to, you know, take a shot on her work. I thought it was a fun read, but yeah, I think I gave it a 3-star, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, check it out if you want something kind of trippy and weird. Another book I read in May was The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. I had this on my TBR for like years now, and I had read The Secret History about 2 years ago. The Secret History is like my favorite book of all time, and so I was hesitant to read this book for 2 reasons. One being that I was nervous that I wasn't gonna like it as much as A Secret History, and 2, it's very long. And I had tried starting it, I think 2 times before, and I put it down for whatever reason. It wasn't that I wasn't enjoying it, but it just wasn't what I was in the mood for at the time. But I had recently posted on Bookstagram about which big book I should try next, and so many people recommended The Goldfinch, and I'm so glad I read it. I don't like it as much as The Secret History, but I think it's an amazing novel. It's clear that Donna Tartt was, you know, flexing her writing skills with this book because the writing is amazing throughout. It's basically the story of a 13-year-old who is at an art museum with his mom, and there's an explosion, a terrorist attack that kills his mom, and when he, you know, wakes up in the rubble, he ends up taking a painting, a very famous painting, The Goldfinch, and it kind of tracks his life story from there and his growing up, holding on to this painting and kind of where he goes in his life after this tragic accident. And I just thought it was so beautiful, and it has one of my favorite characters I've ever read, Boris. And it's super long, but I think she effectively, you know, uses every page with purpose. And I think she was clearly inspired by Charles Dickens. She said that before in interviews. And I can definitely see this being referred to as a Dickensian novel. It's very sweeping. There's so many characters. There's a lot of extra detail, which can be off-putting to some. but I really liked it. I do think sometimes I was kind of bored, like, okay, where are we going with this? But, you know, upon reflection, and especially in light of the last couple of pages, I was just blown away. Like, wow, she is an incredible writer, and I cannot wait to see what she comes out with next. I know she publishes every like 10 years or so, so that's kind of coming up. I think this was published in 2013, so hopefully she has something in the pipeline soon. I can't wait to see what she has next. I haven't read The Little Friend by her, but I want to read that sometime this year, just so I can, you know, have all of her books under my belt, but I guess we'll see. Another book I read is Commonwealth by Ann Patchett, and I absolutely love this book. I read The Dutch House a couple of months back, I think in January, and I really liked it. It wasn't my favorite. I had heard, you know, a lot of people saying that if you like The Dutch House, give Commonwealth a try, and Bel Canto, another book of hers. And so I picked this one up on a whim, and I absolutely loved it. It's one of my favorite books I read this year. I couldn't put it down, and it basically tells a story of two families that are intertwined after an affair, basically, between the parents. There's kind of a lot of characters, so it's hard to sum up easily. But it tells, you know, the story over multiple generations of, you know, the effect that the affair had on the family and kind of where they go from there. And I really thought it was an interesting reflection on kind of the choices that we make and the impact that we have, especially in a family setting, how small or large decisions can have a completely huge impact on an individual and a family. If you haven't read this one, you like Ann Patchett, I highly recommend trying this one. If you want to start reading Ann Patchett, this is a good one to start with. I highly recommend this one. I think the best way to read this book is with a gin and juice, because that's featured prominently throughout the book, hence the oranges on the cover. So yeah, if you're looking for a pairing, definitely do that. Another book I read in May is a thriller called The Guest List by Lucy Foley. And this one is basically, you know, a whodunit style, multiple perspective thriller in which there's a wedding and you see the perspective of, I think, 5 people, and you kind of track different motives. Every character ends up having a motive, and you also don't know who is going to be murdered. So this is a fun read. I think it's a nod to Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, but it's way different than that, and I think Christie's book is a classic and incomparable. But I think this is a fun one if you're looking for, you know, quick beach read, you want like a fun thriller. This is a good one to read. It wasn't my favorite thriller by any means, but I think it's more well written compared to some others that I've read this year. And so I think this one is better than most. So if you're looking for something easy, something quick, this is a fun one to read. Oh, and I should say, I did end up guessing who was the murderer by the end, like, but it took me until like I was close to the end. I was like, oh, I think I know where this is going. And then I got it, so I'm kind of proud of myself for that. I usually don't guess what the twist is or who the murderer is whenever I read murder mysteries or thrillers, so I was proud of myself for that one. But I know a lot of people were stumped by this one, so yeah, it's a fun read. So I think that wraps up. Oh, I think I have one more. I read another Samanta Schweblin book. It's actually back here. It's her newest one, Little Eyes. And this just came out like a month or two ago, and I was super excited for this one because I didn't really know too much about it, but I knew it was like a techno horror novel about surveillance and like cameras, and that's like all I knew, but that sounded amazing. And so I tried this one out, and it was very promising to start. I really liked the idea. It involves these devices called Kentuckys. A person buys a Kentucky, and it's like a stuffed animal robot thing that like drives around your house. But the interesting thing about it is, so you can buy one of those Kentuckys, or you can purchase a software code in which you can look through the eyes of a Kentucky and you're paired randomly with another person. So it's basically a collection of short stories all revolving around the same theme. And you see kind of the effect of whether, you know, having a robot following around your house and the limited communication and not knowing who the person is watching you, kind of how that affects people being surveilled. But it's also interesting seeing the perspective of someone that chooses to buy a software code and watch someone while, you know, trying to find innovative ways to communicate with them. And there's some kind of creepy aspects to this book, but I didn't really think it was that horrifying at all. I wasn't fully happy with this book. I really think, like, when I was reading it, I thought of so many cool ideas where this could have went, but she doesn't really go there with this book. She has a lot of interesting ideas, and I think the setup is awesome, but the execution wasn't there for me, in part because there's multiple stories throughout the book, but they alternate. And so every chapter, like, you're going back and forth between different stories throughout the book. So once one was picking up steam, then you switch to another story again, and you're like, kind of want to know what's going on with that one. And then you're back in another story that you might not have been as interested in. It's not slow per se, but I wish it was a short story collection where each one was kind of its own story told in full, and then the next story came. But I think she wanted to use that style to make it a novel. You learn more about Kentucky's through each story, so it kind of makes sense to do it this way, but I really wish she stuck to a story structure instead, or I don't know, had like a bigger payoff or something. I don't know. I just wasn't completely satisfied with this, even though I was really looking forward to it. So yeah, I would give, again, this one's super short, and you might like it more than I do. I've seen a lot of rave reviews on Bookstagram, but yeah, it's a tiny book, and it's a really interesting premise. Probably one of the most interesting I've read this year. Just wasn't perfect in execution. I think that wraps up what I read in May, but moving to June, I read Emma Straub's All Adults Here, and this one's a perfect beach read, but it's kind of like literary too. I thought there was a lot of depth to this book. I read it for a book club, and I really loved the discussion following reading this book. It opens with an elderly woman who has 3 kids, and she witnesses a friend that she didn't really like get hit by a bus, and she dies. It starts a process of her thinking, am I living my life to the fullest? Should I be telling my kids things that I haven't told them already? Am I living every day like it's my last? Which is kind of a cliche thing to, kind of address through a book, but I thought Emma Straub really did it beautifully. And you see the perspective of her and her 3 kids and grandkids. It had some of my favorite characters. One of the grandchildren, Cecilia, she takes up a big portion of this book. She seems kind of more of an adult than some of the adults do in this book. And I don't know, it was just such a fun read. It was heartwarming. I got teary-eyed at the end during one scene, and I really loved how it wrapped up. So if you're looking for something lighthearted, but is a really good, book for discussion, has a lot of depth to it, I think this, balances that line beautifully, and I highly recommend this one if you're looking for something in that style. Another book I read was Miracle Creek by Angie Kim. This has been on my TBR for over a year now, and I was wrapping up law school and I was about to study for the bar when this book came out in April of last year. And so I was like sick of anything law related, and so I knew this was a literary courtroom thriller. And so I was just like, I don't know if I'm gonna wanna read this right now. It just sounds, I already have too much law stuff in my brain, like let me just not. But I decided to pick it up this month, and I'm really glad I did. This book is phenomenal. I loved it so much. It's basically a murder mystery involving an explosion in a, I can't remember what it's called, hyperbolic. So it's basically an oxygen chamber where people with certain, disorders or illnesses go into it, and there's like a increased level of oxygen or something, and it's in the hopes of curing whatever their illness or disease is. So this novel starts with an explosion within that chamber, which kills a child and a mother who are within it, and there's 6 people in it. And so you try to figure out who did it and why. And it's also a story about immigration and autism and being a parent of a child with autism and the challenges that presents. It raised a lot of interesting questions, and a lot of this book is very heavy, I found. But I thought it was so well done. I thought the mystery was beautifully executed. I didn't guess what happened. She kind of pulled a double twist on you with this book, which I thought was really interesting. But the courtroom scenes, I know some people don't like reading courtroom thrillers because they don't like the courtroom scenes, but I thought they were so awesome. So I really like this one. I think you should check it out. If you're looking for a thriller that's on the more literary side, that has a unique premise, because this one definitely does. I'd never read a book about any of these subjects really before, and so I thought it was a good meshing of those, and I can't wait to see what she does next. And finally, I read 2 thrillers this month, both by Riley Sager, first being Home Before Dark and Lock Every Door. And I had read his first 2 thrillers before, I think like a year or 2 ago, and I liked them. I definitely liked The Last Time I Lied, his second book, the most. And Final Girls, his first book, was pretty good too. I love the idea of, a thriller written in like the slasher style, in which a final girl is, grown up and she has to, deal with the mystery surrounding that. And I thought that was just a cool premise. Both of these books I thought were pretty good. I didn't love either of them. I think I'm just kind of tired of the thriller genre. I think it's a me thing more so than those books, because I think they're really well executed, and I think he constructs a really good mystery, and he always has a unique premise. He kind of uses a different horror trope within each of his thrillers, and I think it's a fun way of kind of approaching it, and I think he's one of the better thriller authors that I've read. I just find myself not being too invested, I guess, in the characters, and I think they're very plot heavy, and so a lot of the time I'm reading, description within thrillers, and I'm kind of like, okay, this doesn't really matter at all. Sometimes I feel like when I read thrillers, I'm like, I could have just read a plot synopsis, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, and, save myself the day or 2 that it took me to read the thriller. And that's kind of how I felt with these. But I think if you do like thrillers and you like plot-driven stories, these are definitely ones to check out. I just think it's kind of my personal preference right now. I'm trying to find more literary thrillers because I do like the genre. I like murder and I like all of that stuff. But I just I'm looking for a little bit more substance in them so I can feel like a little bit more invested in the characters. And so, yeah, I think if you like thrillers, you should check out both, but they just weren't really for me. I think I gave them both 3 stars. I'm hoping to read some more books in July and going forward, you know, kind of sticking to monthly wrap-ups instead of doing, you know, kind of a bulk wrap-up. But I guess we'll see what I read for July. I'm still not even sure what I want to read. I think TBRs for me are kind of useless at this point. I never read what I end up picking for like a TBR. I don't really stick to it, so I guess it's a mystery. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and cheers.